Hello everyone, this is Gary, and in this video I'm going to show you my current custom settings for the Panasonic GH5M2 camera for March of 2023. Now, I've been using these cameras for almost a decade, and so I've got mine highly customized, and while you may not find my settings to suit your own preferences, you could definitely take some inspiration from my settings, and you will learn about some of the most important features that this camera has to offer for video along the way. So this could also be useful for intermediate and even some beginner users. So let's go and get started. So once you've downloaded the custom settings, you can go to the memory card. Now this folder add_Lumix may not appear, but you need to create this folder. Then you need to create a folder called cam set, as you see here. And then you would simply copy the settings over to this folder. Now, if you do save custom settings from within the camera, then these folders will be created automatically. Add_Lumix, camset, and camset the file. So just keep that in mind. If the folders don't appear, you have to create them. Add_Lumix at the root of the memory card, and then camset, and then you can paste your custom settings in here. Now, speaking of memory cards, I use SanDisk V30, just regular Extreme Pro memory cards. Now these will support every single recording mode in the camera except for the 400 megabits a second all-lie in 4K. Now I personally don't need that, so I just use these V30 cards. They guarantee a minimum write speed of 30 megabytes per second. First, let me go and talk about my philosophy. I don't like to use a touchscreen. I like to have physical buttons mapped with my most common settings. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started first by turning on the camera, and I'm going to press this button right here, the menu set button, and we're going to go to the wrench icon down there and then the gear icon, and I'm going to go to save restore camera setting, load, and we're going to load from the memory card, and it's loaded my camera settings. Now right now the screen brightness has been turned way up because that's part of my custom settings because I tend to shoot in daylight. So for the purposes of this tutorial, we'll just bring it down to -1 so it's within more proper exposure for this video. So if I press the dial right here on the left, you can see I've got the record quality, my list. Now this is a custom list that you're able to populate with your preferred or favorite recording modes. Now if I go into the menu, you can see under the video recorder, the film strip, under the image format menu, if I go to record quality, you can see that there are a bunch of options here, and it might be a little bit tedious to be scrolling through these if you only like to use maybe 3 or 4 different options. So that's where the my list comes in. Here's the record quality my list. I've added the ones that I like the most, and then I've assigned it to this button. Now to assign any sort of custom button, you just hold it down for a little bit over a second, and now you can see that we've got all of the different options in this camera that we can assign buttons to. So I'm just going to go ahead and scroll down real quick so you can see all of the different options that we have here. So I'm going to press this button. It's set to my list, and I've got just 2 pages now as opposed to I think it was 6 pages. And actually I would reduce this down even more. So let's say that you are someone who just likes to shoot in 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second, as well as 120 frames per second slow motion or variable frame rate on this camera, and you do not like 24 frames per second. Well, you can take the list that I provided and you can simply press the Q button to delete or remove these from that list. So you could whittle this down to just 1 page with maybe 5 or 6 options. If I want to switch from, say, 4K 30 to 4K 60, I just press this, and that's it, I'm done. I've confirmed it with menu set. So if I want to go back to 4K 30, I scroll, and I'm done. So that is very useful. You can change your frame rates very fast with this method. Now, let's go and go to the top option. What does that do? Well, I currently have it set for toggling between Vlog and natural. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but well, when you're recording with this camera, you can't change your profile. You can't change your photo style is what Panasonic calls it, right? So here are your photo styles, and I've currently disabled a lot of them. I have them off. So I'm going to cover that a little bit as well when we go through the menu. But I can actually toggle between Vlog and natural, which are my favorite photo styles for this camera. There are many others. There's flat, there's Rec 7 or like 709. They're standard, and you're free to use whichever ones you want to use, but I really like Vlog and Natural. And again, you can change this while you're recording, and most people do not know that. And it's primarily because it's assigned to a custom button. So how does this work? If I press up, you can see what's really going on is I've got the photo style set to Vlog for that custom profile. However, I'm currently in Natural, so I've been able to choose any other photo style I want. Let's go with flat, for example, or just monochrome, doesn't matter. Now, if I press up, we're going to cycle to Vlog, and we're going to go back to monochrome. Vlog, monochrome. So I'm going to switch this back to Natural, which is my preferred profile, along with Vlog, as you can see. So basically, I am toggling between two different photo styles. Now you can see that I like to switch between my two favorite photo styles using this button here. So I go into Vlog or Natural. So Natural is primarily for low dynamic range and slow motion shots, and then Vlog is for higher dynamic range along with 10-bit footage. So let's switch back to Natural. Let's go and cover what this button does. This is my audio recording level adjustments. So if I hold that down, this button down, the right button on the dial here, you can see sound record level adjustment. Okay, let's see what's on the bottom. I'm here toggling between the waveform monitor, which I have on by default, Vectorscope, and I've positioned the Vectorscope in a very specific location, and I'll explain why I found this to be the optimal position later. And then if I press down, we turn off all of these different assists here. Now I don't use the histogram for video, so I do not have it on right now, so we're just toggling between waveform monitor, Vectorscope, and no assist. Alright, so let's see, what does this button do? If I press it, we go to Monochrome Live View, and it's just a black and white rendering of your live view here. Of course, it doesn't record this to the video. This can be useful when doing focus peaking. I currently have this as my custom button down here, although it might change later, but for now, this is what I've got this set to. So just Monochrome Live View. Alright, so let's look at the buttons up here. So the Q menu, I've customized it to my own liking. I've got the exposure mode here, the metering mode, the sound level record display that I can toggle. I've got my frame marker, and then my zebra pattern, night mode, which I probably will rarely use, variable frame rate, settings, and then focus peaking, and then of course the sensitivity for that. Synchro Scan I actually have on by default, and again I'm going to explain this stuff later. And then focus transition, which is a fun little mode that I rarely use, but I like it, and so I do want to have it on there for when I do want to use it. And then of course I can turn off the image stabilizer, or of course turn it on. So here we've got the AF mode button. So we're currently in manual focus, but if we go to continuous focus, then by pressing this button we're going to be able to choose the different AF modes, and I use these arrows here. So if I like this one right here, you can see it says AF area. You press this button down, and then you see the dials here. You can make this larger, you can move the focus point, and you can also press the display button to reset it. And then you can use this dial to go back down and then confirm with the set button. So I'm going to press this button again and go down to one area. Of course, you can enable animal detection or human detection as well. So I'm going to leave it back to one area, and I'm just going to confirm by pressing menu set. Okay, so let's go and talk about the joystick here. If I press it inward, I bring up my Luminance spot meter. Now, I like it set there because I can just press it twice to quickly bring it up and confirm the location of the Luminance spot meter. If you press it again, the Luminance spot meter will go away. So while you're in a Rec 709 profile, such as Natural, the Luminance spot meter will display a percentage with 50% meaning middle gray. But when you switch to Vlog, then it'll display the Luminance spot metering in stops. And 0.0 stops would be middle gray. So let's go back to Natural, and let's turn off the Luminance spot meter. I don't use it much, and I may end up removing that setting and changing to something else, but for now I still like it there. So let's press left on this. You can see that I've got this set to near focusing. The AF on is set to far focus, and this is set to near focus. Now in this particular shot here, you're not going to see much of a difference, but let me go ahead and bring this closer, and we're going to near focus on it. Now I'm going to put the focusing area right here. If I want to do far focus, you can see it focused on those mics. But if I do near focus, it's going to focus on, generally it's going to focus on what's closer. This is not the best example of this, but like if you're recording animals in the forest or something, and you need to quickly prioritize more of something closer, this is what I use for that. I use this. Now, if I hold down the button, it's going to engage that operation, but you can't actually change the custom button. Some custom settings cannot be changed. They cannot be changed by just holding the button. Once you've set it, they cannot be changed. And the AF near and far is something you cannot change. So let's go to the menu set button here. And let's go down to the wrench icon. And let's go over to the FN button set, settings and record mode. So you can see if we scroll down, for FN12 we've got AF on near, and if we keep going down over here, we've got on page 1 AF on far for this button right here. So just keep that in mind that some custom buttons cannot actually be changed by holding down the button. You have to go into the menu and assign them under FN button set. Alright, so let's go ahead and continue on. We'll go with the down button here. So what's that set to? You can see that icon right there. When I press down, you can see that it's got a little window there with the hand, or a little box, and then when I press it again, we've got that. Now what that is what's known as the IS boost function. Now on the Panasonic GH5 it was called the IS lock, but here they call it the IS boost, and if I hold it down you can see IS boost. It's a video feature. So there are videos made about this feature, but the idea of it is if you handhold the lens, there may be a little bit of shake still, but the moment you engage IS boost, it's going to attempt to keep that shot locked off. And if you move the camera quickly, or if you move it side to side, then it may have a bit of a jerky motion as it finally has to give in and allow the stabilizer to reposition. If you want to hold the camera steady, you just press this down and you've got your IS boost enabled. This is a very important feature in the camera. It's also important to know that you can enable this feature or toggle it while you're recording video. So you can switch while you're recording. Alright, so let's cover the right button here. You can see I've got image area video. Now, the Panasonic GH5 called this something like extended teleconvert. So if I press this, it says image area of video. Okay, so I can go ahead and go here, and now we've cropped into a 1:1 pixel readout. So pixel by pixel readout, and then we can confirm it. But that was a lot of buttons to press just to confirm it. There's a better way. You can press this button twice and then use the shutter button here to confirm. You can even confirm and hit record at the same time. So for example, if I want to do a 1:1 pixel readout and hit record, I can do this and hit record. And now we are recording with that 1:1 pixel readout. Let's go back to image area video. And again, I've confirmed that by pressing this button, the right button that I've got it assigned to, and pressing it again real quick, and then confirming with the half press of the shutter. So again, so keep in mind that you cannot change the image area video while you're recording video. You have to wait for the data to be finished right into the card before you can change it. So for example, let's say I'm recording this clip, and let's imagine I've already zoomed in all the way I can on this lens. So I'm going to record a video with the shutter button here, and I want to get a bit of a close-up. So I'm going to stop recording. I'm going to wait for these red icons to go away, indicating that we've finished writing the video to the memory card, and then I can press this button twice and hit record. And yes, it is very easy to change between a 1:1 pixel readout and a full sensor readout. So what's going on with the full sensor readout is we're oversampling the entire 20 megapixel sensor to record the video. And when we do this, go to image area video, we are recording a 1:1 pixel readout. So we're cropping into roughly 8.3 megapixels on this 20 megapixel sensor, which is roughly a 1.3 crop. You can do the same thing in the full HD mode. So let's go over here to, we're going to choose 24 all I. Now here what will happen is instead of cropping in 1.3x, it's going to crop in roughly 2.6x. So let's do this. See that? So just keep that in mind that for full HD it's going to crop in more, because a 1:1 pixel readout in full HD would be roughly a 2 megapixel portion of this 20 megapixel sensor. Okay, so I've switched back to 4K 30. Let's cover the top option here. What does this do? You can see I've got focus ring lock. Now this is a very specific feature that I personally use. You may find it to be pointless, but if I'm holding the camera, I don't want to accidentally nudge this and get my focus off. So what I can do is I can acquire my focus and press this button up here, which is set to up. It's called focus ring lock. You can see it right there. So if I press it up, I am toggling between focus ring lock and of course focus ring lock disabled, which of course would be the default. Now you can change this, you can toggle this while you're recording. So I like to do focus ring lock occasionally, and then I know that no matter if I accidentally touch this ring here, this focus ring, I will not change my focus. And you'll see that when you press it, it says MFL, which means manual focus lock. So if I go back here, it's manual focus, and then manual focus lock. So right now I've got manual focus lock engaged, and you might be inclined to think that if I use the manual focus clutch, which is available on some Panasonic Leica lenses to give a linear focusing experience, you may think that this feature MFL doesn't work, but it actually does. So it doesn't matter whether you're using the clutch or not, manual focus lock will not allow any manual focusing to occur with the ring, whether you're in a clutch mode or not. So let's go back to the standard mode. So we've turned off manual focus lock. Let's continue on. So I've taken off my viewfinder eye cup here because I use a aftermarket one that's a little bit big. But by default, you can see that if you put your hand over the sensor right here, it'll switch to the electronic viewfinder. And if you do this, it'll go back to the live view. So you can control that with the LVF button here. So you can toggle between the screen only, a sensor-based control of that, or you can go back to just a viewfinder only. Now, if you prefer to use just the screen and not let this right here affect it, affect the way that this display will be on, then if you close the screen, then automatically the viewfinder will turn on. So you can go back out and shoot like this, knowing that by putting your finger here, you're not going to turn the screen off. And if I hold the button, you can see it's called LVF monitor switch. And that is a setting as well in the menu that you can adjust. I'm going to give some tips about the playback features on this camera. So let's just press the playback button. So your last shot video will usually appear. It'll show you how long it is. And you can see if you press the up button right here, the up arrow here on the dial, it'll automatically start playing the video back. You can control the volume by using this. And you can see the playback controls here. So I'm going to stop playing back by pressing down. Now, you can use this dial right here to zoom out and see more of your videos that you've shot. You can even do it again and see even more videos. And if you do it again, it'll actually show the dates of the videos that you're recording. So by being aware of the controls here, then what you can do is you could actually control playback completely within the viewfinder. So if you prefer shooting with the viewfinder and say you want to play back a video that you shot and see how well it came out, then you can just press that and control everything with these dials here. You don't need to open up the screen to see the video that you shot. So let's go back. So let's say I've shot a video and I'm not using an external monitor and I want to be absolutely certain that it's in focus. So what I can do is on the very first frame of the video, you can actually use this dial here to zoom in to the video, and you can see if you got the area in focus that you want. Now, unfortunately, that's not an option for the rest of the video. So for every other frame, you can't really zoom in and crop in. So what I'll do is I'll stop here. Let's say this is another area of the video I want to verify that I'm in focus. A workaround is to press Menu Set, save the image. So notice I'm doing this and I'm pressing this, and then I press the stop playback, and then I go over here to the next video or the next piece of media, and that's actually the frame that I just saved. And then I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, and you can see that I can verify if that's in focus. So if you're not using an external monitor and you just quickly want to verify if something was in focus, you can save frames on the most critical areas and just make sure that it's in focus. And of course, I just mentioned this a few seconds ago, but you can use these arrows here to go between different shots. So now I'm going to cover what I've got the buttons up here set up to. So white balance, of course, is set to currently 5700K, which is a standard sort of default for daylight. I've got some of these other ones set as well, but you may want to be changing these to your own preference, because right now I've got my window tint of my truck baked in here so that I can get a 5700 Kelvin look while driving in broad daylight. Again, you may not like this. The tint here can be adjusted. You can do two things with white balance under the Kelvin. There's actually several different ways to set white balance in the camera. There's some auto white balance methods. There are some presets over here. And then, of course, there are your custom ones where you can aim a gray card at the camera, and obviously you can do it like that, and you can use the Kelvin values. Now, I prefer using the Kelvin values. I just want to show that if I want to, a feature about the cameras, if I want to adjust my white balance, I can not only press up to adjust it in Kelvin values, so let's go back to 5700 and confirm it with menu set. I can press down to control the tint of that. And this is where the Vectorscope can come in handy. So let's engage the Vectorscope by pressing this button to toggle and see it. Now when I press the white balance button here, WB, you can see that it's nicely set over here, and when I go to adjust, it also isn't in the way. So it's also not in the way over there. So this is exactly why I've got the Vectorscope in my opinion, the most optimal position for this camera. Let's go ahead and turn it off. Now here's where it's going to get a little bit interesting, where this button by default is your photo styles, but as you know, I prefer just to use these two photo styles, natural and vlog, so I'm set with that. So what have I set this to? Well, if I hold it down, you can see it's set to, oddly enough, auto white balance. And I've done the same trick that I've done here with this button here. So just like I can change between natural and vlog, I can actually change between auto white balance and my current white balance setting. So right now we are currently set to, you can see Kelvin 2. Let's go back to Kelvin 1. You can see it says Kelvin 1. And notice how if you've adjusted the tint, it'll actually have a slightly different color. So let's go back to Kelvin 1. The white balance, I'm currently with a custom setting of 5700K. However, if I press this button and go to auto white balance, again, you do not always want to trust this because the tint of your objects in your scene will change and confuse the auto white balance very easily. So you have to use this sort of method with a grain of salt. I use it as a general guide with great success, but you have to know what you're doing and you have to be very cautious with it because auto white balance can get it wrong a lot, but sometimes it can give you a slightly better result than what you've dialed in. So also, just for those who may not know, you can affect your white balance while you're recording. So even though I'm recording right now, I can not only toggle between auto white balance and a custom setting, I can even press the white balance button and switch to a different white balance. I can even adjust my tint and my settings, my Kelvin, while I'm recording. So say I'm driving the truck and I want to get a shot with the tint of the window baked in here. Well, I'm on my Kelvin 2 value, and it's of course a sunny day, so I'm at 5700K. But let's say I open the window and I want to get a shot outside without stopping recording. Well, I just go to my white balance, I do this, I can do this, and then I halfway press shutter to confirm that. So there's multiple ways of operating here, but if I go to white balance, and I can even use this too. So for example, white balance, this, and then halfway press shutter, or white balance button, this, and then halfway press shutter. Now, if you're in auto white balance and you press the white balance button, it's going to give you another option. So you of course need to press this button here to go back to the custom setting that you have. Otherwise, you're just going to be in auto white balance and you will have to change it to something like, say, this, and then if you press this again, it'll go back to auto white balance. So just keep that in mind. This is a toggle. It's very useful to be aware of this. Now, you may not like to work like this, and that's totally fine. But this is just the way that I have it set up, and I find this to be useful for me. Especially during sunset when the lighting gets really confusing, then I find that sometimes using auto white balance can give me a reading of what the camera thinks is right, but I can just use it as a general guide. Alright, so let's continue on. Let's go and stop recording. Now here I've got the ISO button. It's set to, of course, adjust the ISO. But I've enabled the ISO limit, which you can control with this dial. And to enable that, so you can see under the wrench icon, under operation, you can go to ISO displayed setting, and you can choose ISO limit over ISO. See it? So with that, and once you press ISO, you'll see the ISO limit. And I've covered this in a previous video as well. So for example, instead of having to dig through the menu and going to here and image quality 1, ISO sensitivity, and changing the ISO upper limit setting like that, I can just press the ISO button and then use this dial right here to change the ISO limit. I just wanted you to be aware that this is actually a better way of doing it. So here we've got our exposure compensation, and if I press this, we are currently in shutter priority. So if I press the exposure compensation button, I can then use this dial right here. That's the EV button right here, the exposure compensation. If I press this button or this dial, then I can control my exposure compensation. However, that is very inefficient, having to press this button and then controlling your exposure compensation. Well, there's a better way of doing it. I currently have it set up to where all I have to do is use the dial. So this button is actually not being used at all while I'm in a semi-auto exposure mode. So now keep in mind that if I'm in a manual exposure mode for video, even though my ISO currently is in auto, then when I move this, it's not going to do anything. It's just going to actually change the aperture as opposed to the exposure compensation. This is why that I still have this button assigned to exposure compensation, because if I press it, then in manual exposure mode, I can control the exposure compensation for auto ISO. However, I don't usually shoot like that, but when I'm in a shutter priority mode, for example, then this dial becomes truly dedicated to exposure compensation. And then when I'm in manual mode, I tend not to use exposure compensation. I tend to just, of course, use manual settings, but I can still gain access to this exposure compensation if I really wanted to. So I did make a video about exposure settings and things like how to control the ISO dial so that you can be in auto ISO and then control in 1/3 EV increments. So this is the record button, and I've actually got it set to auto exposure lock. And you can see AEL is down there, see? So when I press it here, AEL went away. So now we're using auto exposure. And here we're using auto exposure lock. And I'm currently in a manual exposure mode, and it does work in manual exposure if you have auto ISO enabled. If ISO is set to an actual value, then AEL will not work, because AEL can't do nothing if the exposure is not even in auto anyway. But now that it is in a semi-auto mode, we're in manual exposure mode with auto ISO, then AEL will work. Now, the reason why I have AEL set to this button is because this button is very quiet when you press it. It doesn't click. See, these buttons here click. But this button is very quiet. So I prefer to use auto exposure lock when using shutter priority to record video. And before I continue on, this button cannot be enabled by just holding down the button. You have to actually go into, again, it's one of those options that you have to go into the FN button set, settings and record mode, and you have to enable it with AEL, see? So auto exposure lock is a very useful way to work, and I do use it when using variable aperture zooms. I use it in combination with the exposure compensation. It actually does not lock your settings. It simply locks the exposure, and that is very critical to be aware of. It locks the exposure, not the settings. So just to give a quick example, let's say that I want to get a proper video of this little audio recorder. Now we can see that this is very, very bright. Let's bring up our waveform monitor. And let's go and use we're in shutter priority, let's go and use our EV right here to tone this down to something a little bit more in line with the way it should look on video. Now, let's lock that exposure by pressing this button here. And now, the exposure is locked. And what's interesting is, no matter where I am aim the camera, the exposure is locked. However, if I switch, this is where it gets very powerful. If I switch from, say, 4K 30, notice right now we're in 4K 30, 180-degree shutter angle with 800 ISO. If I switch to 4K 60, we are going to double our ISO, but the exposure is going to be maintained. Watch. The reason why the ISO doubled to 1600 is because the 180-degree shutter angle automatically changed the shutter speed from 1/60th to 1/120th. So we lost the stop of light, and we have now gained a perceived stop of light by doubling the ISO by 1 stop. So we've compensated for the 1 EV loss on the shutter speed, and we've gained it back with ISO. But notice that not only did the exposure itself not change because it was locked, but the settings were still able to be manipulated even though exposure is locked. So exposure lock or auto exposure lock does not actually prohibit the camera from changing settings. So just be aware of that. It simply locks the brightness of the video, basically the exposure. So let's continue on. This is not a video about auto exposure lock, but there is a reason why I use it. And another thing that you may not be aware of is even when using variable aperture zoom lenses, this is also extremely useful, because as you're zooming in, you can have your exposure locked, but the camera will automatically be changing the aperture as well as the ISO to compensate for the loss of brightness when you're using a variable aperture zoom while zooming in. Now, this is not a variable aperture zoom lens, but again, I'm just giving an example of this particular button and why I've got it set to AEL and why I love AEL so much. It's not always the best way to work. I also tend to shoot in manual exposure too for video, but again, I just really like auto exposure lock. You may not like it. On my dials here, you can see that I've got my current video settings here, and if we go to C1, this is where I've got photography settings set up. So C1 is actually manual exposure, and then C2 is shutter priority, and then C3 is aperture priority. So on the C4 dial, I've got a very obscure recording method that I've got going on here. Now, we know that contrast detect autofocus in video can cause pulsing. However, while you're actually tracking a subject side to side, for example, it may not pulse at all, and it can actually be quite good. But once that subject stops moving, that's where the pulsing can become quite annoying. So on C4, I've got manual exposure with autofocus lock set to this button. So if I press autofocus lock, it will automatically lock the autofocus and make it into more of a locked focus. So you can see I've got it set to, in FN button set, you can see that AFL autofocus lock. This is a very obscure way of working. I rarely use this, but I just like to experiment with it, and so I put it on C4 because it is very antithetical to auto exposure lock. You cannot use both settings at the same time. So that's why on C4 I've changed a custom button here from auto exposure lock to auto focus lock. But again, it's a very obscure way of working, and even I don't use it that much. Let's go back to our movie settings. And again, I have all of my photography settings over here to the C dials, but you may prefer to have them where they naturally belong over here, and that's fine. It's just I've got mine set up a little bit differently. I'm prioritized video, so it's just a little bit different. I didn't want my, for example, the reason why I've got it set up is because when I go over to, say, shutter priority, I don't want to see the meters. So my custom settings for photography have turned on the histogram, and they've disabled meters and things like that. So I focus just on photography over here, and then if I go to video, you can see we've got more of a video priority look. So just keep that in mind, that's why I've got my C dials set to photography settings. But if you don't like that, then by all means you can use these over here. If I press the display button, you can see it says operation lock. Now, a lot of people complain that when you hold this camera, you can accidentally press the display button, which is right here. Now, of course, you can disable that button. So I've disabled it. If we go to our operation lock setup in the menu, you can see that I've set it to disable the display button. Now, this will only work if you have the operation lock set to a custom button, and it's actually set to this button right here. So if I press this, operation lock is disabled. So now I can press this button and cycle between the different display options. But if I press this button again, it'll engage operation lock, which is the default for me. I rarely turn it off. So of course it's a smart setting, because if I go into the menu and I go to, say, any setting, and I press the display button, it's currently unlocked, even though it's locked in live view mode. See, operation lock. But if I go over here and I press it, then the functionality of it works just fine in playback as well as the menu. So in the menu, when you press the display button, it brings up a quick description of what different settings do. So if I go to ISO displayed setting, it will actually tell me a little bit about that setting. So for example, in manual exposure, change aperture and shutter speed for recording video. So it's just giving a very simplistic description of what some settings do. It's a toggle, so you can turn it off or you can turn it back on. And of course, it's remembered when you get out of the menu. But if I go back into live view and I hit display, it's going to say operation lock. If I press the playback button and I look at a video that I just shot, if I press display, it actually does work here. The display button is very useful, but when you're in record mode or live view, it can be annoying sometimes, so I have it on operation lock. So now let's go to the menu and see I've got some things set up. So we're going to go to the top of the menu here, go to photo style, and as you can see, I currently do not have many photo styles enabled. I think I have the least amount of photo styles you can have enabled. Actually, I think you can take out flat too, but I only have a few photo styles because, again, I only use natural and vlog anyway, so I don't need all of these photo styles being displayed. Now I'll show you how to control that. You just go over to the settings and you go to photo style settings over here under the wrench, under image quality, and you can go to show hide photo style, and I've pretty much hidden most of them, including the custom ones. So just keep that in mind, and we're going to continue on with photo style. You can see that with natural, I leave everything alone except I remove all in-camera sharpening and I remove all in-camera noise reduction, because I like to control these two aspects of the video in post-production. Let's continue on with V-Log-L, which is my other preferred photo style. With this one, I leave everything alone. You cannot adjust the contrast or saturation anyway in it, but over here with sharpness and noise reduction, they are automatically as low as they can get. They don't have a negative value. You can just simply increase the sharpness or increase the noise reduction, but I prefer these to be left at the default, which is the least amount of sharpening and the least amount of noise reduction. Alright, so let's continue on. We're going to switch back to natural. Now notice how, because I've selected V-Log in the menu, I can't switch back to natural, so I've broken my little toggle. Not a big deal. Go back to photo styles, set it to natural, or the one that I prefer, right? And now I can switch back to V-Log. Let's say that I'm wanted to shoot flat and V-Log-L. Well, I've gone to flat, and now I can toggle between V-Log-L and flat. So anyways, natural and V-Log-L, my two preferred photo styles. Let's continue on. My metering mode is set to evaluative metering, which is the default. Now my ISO sensitivity, I have adjusted that, and it might seem a little counterintuitive. By default, the lowest ISO limit is 200. And so if you're just shooting natural, I think it's fine to leave it at 200. However, because I shoot V-Log and natural, and V-Log, we know the base ISO in V-Log is 400, I tend to set this to 400 as the lowest, even while recording natural. Now, again, this seems very counterintuitive because most people like to shoot at the lowest ISO, but because I toggle between natural and V-Log-L, and I get a similar exposure in some cases, but because I toggle between natural and V-Log-L, and because I also use shutter priority quite a bit, I prefer to let the ISOs be at a very similar base ISO so that my aperture will be maintained a very similar amount. So again, it's a bit counterintuitive, but I prefer my ISO sensitivity to be the lowest to be 400. Now that doesn't mean that I can't set a lower ISO than 400 in video. It's just when you're in auto ISO, the lowest would be 400. So Synchro Scan allows you to dial in your shutter angle or shutter speed in very fine increments. Now this setting allows your camera to reach a sort of equilibrium with the flickering of lights in a scene, such as an indoor environment. However, I like it on because if I accidentally touch my shutter dial here, you can see that I'm not really going to affect my shutter angle in any perceived way. And so I use this as a bit of a soft sort of lock on my shutter angle because I prefer to keep it at a certain amount at 180 degrees. So this is very useful. Now, if I go into my quick menu here, I can turn it off if I really need to turn it off and adjust my shutter speed, or in this case shutter angle, which affects shutter speed based on the frame rate, in 1/3 stop increments. But if I don't want to do that, then I'll switch this to Synchro Scan on, and we're good to go. SS gain operation, this is how you turn on the shutter angle option. So I have that, of course, enabled. Vignetting comp, I found that this is kind of useful, so this will compensate for vignetting in the video itself, and I find it to be just fine. For the other settings, I leave them alone. Diffraction compensation just sharpens the video once diffraction starts to take place when your aperture is stopped down, but I would never shoot with the aperture stopped down anyway, so I just leave this off. Let's continue on. Got our settings here we covered a little bit ago. Now variable frame rate. I'm going to show you how I shoot variable frame rate footage on this camera. It is much faster than what everybody else recommends on YouTube. So what a lot of people recommend is to put your slow motion on one of these dials. But one of the problems with that is, what if your white balance didn't carry over? Well, my white balance is currently set to whatever it is, right? So it's at Kelvin 1. If I want to go to variable frame rate slow motion, I simply go to here and I'm done. So now I'm currently at a frame rate of 120 frames per second with a target frame rate of 24 frames per second. And we're using the 420 8-bit. But before I continue and show that, I'm going to remove a lot of the options from this quick menu because I want to simplify it and show you how. Let's say that you just shoot 24 frames per second and 60 frames per second as your preferred, along with 120 frames per second for slow motion. Let's go and remove a lot of these options right now and simplify it, and then I'll show you how I do my variable frame rate. So what I've done is I've simplified my list here, and I've set it up to where you only have a few options, and it's just for someone who likes to shoot 24 frames per second and then 60 frames per second. So they like to do 24 frames per second as their primary mode, and then 60 frames per second for some slow motion, along with maybe 120 frames per second for VFR. So what I've done is, for example, if they're shooting 24 frames per second here, now you want to shoot 60 for some slow motion, you can do that. But let's say you want to shoot slow motion at 120 frames per second with VFR, you can just do this, go all the way down, and you're done. Now, what's going on here is variable frame rate is always enabled, but because a lot of modes don't support variable frame rate, such as the 10-bit regular long GOP 4K mode, then variable frame rate, it says it's off, and it is off, but as you can see, it can't even be selected in here anyway. But the moment we go to a slow motion mode, you can see that it's on, or a mode that supports slow motion variable frame rate, I should say, because Full HD 420 chroma subsampling 8-bit long GOP is not really a slow motion mode. It simply supports VFR. So you can see that variable frame rate is on. Now, to change my variable frame rate settings, I can go here and I can go into the menu, and I can of course change the amount of slow motion. And over here in the quick menu, you can see that variable frame rate, I can also set it here. So that's why I have it in the quick menu, because for example, if I go to 4K 24 and then I want to do some slow motion, I can go over here, done, and then I can go to the quick menu and select VFR and then use this dial to change the amount of slow motion if I need to. So just keep that in mind. Now also be aware that our image area video, the 1:1 sensor crop in 1080p or Full HD, you can also use it in variable frame rate, but there is a limit as to what the frame rate is that it's supported on. So for example, if I go to 144 frames per second, it's still supported, but that is the limit when you're in 24 frames per second, our target frame rate. So you can see that right here. Let's go to 156, and you can see that I can no longer use the image area video. So the setting's not broken, it's just the camera cannot do it. So it has to go to the full-on sensor and then probably do some sort of additional pixel binning or whatever it does to achieve the higher frame rate. So just keep in mind the camera's not broken, it's just that variable frame rate does not support 1:1 pixel readout at faster frame rates beyond 144 frames per second while in a 24 frames per second target frame rate. So that means if I go to my record quality and go to say something like Full HD at 30 frames per second, you can see there will be another number that it's not 144, it's actually 135. So this is the limit for 30 frames per second target frame rate. 135 actual frames per second in slow motion is the limit that you can use the pixel per pixel readout at a 30 frames per second target frame rate. So just be aware that there are some limitations, but the camera's not broken. So just let's continue on. But the main point of all this is to show you that I can quickly change my settings while I'm doing slow motion, and then I can go back to say 4K 24 and we're good to go if we want to do regular speed video, or if it's 4K 30 if that's your preferred thing, if you're primarily doing video and you don't want the the movie look, and that's fine. So it's just that I've got it set up to where I can quickly go to my slow motion again, my target frame rate of 24, press the Q menu, change the frame rate, and then halfway press shutter. So that's kind of how everything works. Alright, let's continue on to the menu. Let's go beyond variable frame rate. I don't use a time code. A luminance level is set to 0 to 255. Now AF custom setting is blurred out. Even though I'm in continuous autofocus and we're not using a manual focus clutch, the reason why is because we're in VFR, and VFR does not support autofocus. However, with the GH5M2, you are able to use a one-time autofocus to set it prior to recording video. Let's continue on. Let's go and switch this to a regular recording mode, or a mode that actually supports autofocus. Let's go back to the settings, and you can change your settings here. I've got mine set to AF speed -3 and AF sensitivity to +2. That seems to work pretty good for me. Continuous AF is set to mode 1, and that's primarily so that I can save battery life. And then focus peaking, now you can control the color inside here. However, the way I actually control focus peaking is in the quick menu. So I turn it on and we're good to go. So quick menu, this dial to turn it off, and then halfway press shutter to get out of it. So if I want to enable focus peaking, I just do this. Now another thing is you can change the focus peaking sensitivity in here as well. Now in the past I've had focus peaking set to a custom button, one of these buttons here. So while I'm rolling here, I cannot enable or disable focus peaking because it's in the quick menu, and you cannot access the quick menu while you're recording video. But if you do want to be able to change or enable focus peaking, or basically toggle it on and off while you're recording video, you would have to assign it to a custom button. So it can be done, it's just I don't really use focus peaking as much anymore, and so therefore I just relegate it to the quick menu. It's not a super high priority item. So let's continue on to sound level display on. Now the limiter is on. If you're trying to get in-camera recordings and you're very serious, you probably would want to turn off the limiter. And then of course, to adjust the volume of it, I of course use this. And I can adjust the volume like this with the dial. If you halfway press shutter, it will not confirm that, by the way. So you have to go in here, set it, and then press menu set to confirm. Let's set it back to -6. Another thing that you need to be aware of is that you can change your sound record level while you're recording video. Alright, so let's continue on. You can see my settings there. We've got the sound output. I do not know why it's in real time. It should actually be in record sound if you ask me. So record sound would have a little bit of a delay when you're using headphones to monitor your sound, but it's the actual recorded sound and not the real-time sound. So I probably should change that to record sound. Headphone volume, that's for when you're actually listening in headphones. So monitoring your sound. Let's continue on. So you can see these are my settings, and again, I've not really adjusted them a whole lot. Alright, let's go to the wrench icon here. Alright, so photo style settings. You can see that I hit a lot of the photo styles that I just don't use. Let's continue on. I use the back button here to get out of that menu. Let's keep going. ISO increments are 1/3 EV, of course. I do not use extended ISO. Alright. And you can load these options and see what I've done in these settings. So there's nothing else that's significant that I've changed. And of course I have gone to all of the menus in the camera, and I have changed the settings to what I prefer. But I'm not going to cover all of them here. But I will mention the zebra pattern. So I currently have my zebra set to zebra 2, and if I go to set, you can see zebra 1 is 55% and zebra 2 is 105%. So zebra 2 is basically the clipping point even in the super white. So if I enable my zebras, let's go to the quick menu. Again, I don't really use, I actually have them on by default, and you can see that. You can see my zebras right there. But if I go to vlog, my zebras are actually set to 80 IRE, which is the cutoff point for vlog, and if I go to natural, they're set to 105. So just keep that in mind. Of course, I like the red frame indicator because, of course, when you hit record, it will display it. Let's continue on. I do not do live streaming, so I don't have any expertise in that area. Now, the focus ring control, I've got it set right now to enabled. So for this lens, it's linear. So while this lens does have a focus clutch, the throw is only about 90 degrees, probably not even that. So it's quite sensitive. However, if you do this and go back to the regular focusing, by default, focus ring control is set to non-linear. So it's not very repeatable. Let's switch this thing to manual focus. It's not very repeatable because it's based on the speed at which you turn it. But let's switch this back to linear, and you can actually go to set and you can change the amount of degrees you want the throw to be. So for example, 180 degrees means that if I turn this from 0 to 180, I get the full range of the focus. So it's very useful. It's a very useful feature, and you will have to update some of the Panasonic lenses in order to get this feature. And this feature it's only available on the cameras with the S series menu system, I believe, including the G9. It's available on this camera, of course, the GH6 and the full frame cameras by Panasonic. I'm going to go to the wrench icon, and of course it's where you can format your card, things like that. Now, some of these settings you're going to see in a few minutes. I have put these settings into, if you want to save, so if you want to save your settings, this is how you save your camera settings. Now, keep settings while format is an excellent option. It should be on by default, but it's off by default, but I have it on. And what that does is, even if you format your memory cards, the custom settings file that's on the memory card will be kept. So let's go ahead and continue on to the last few settings. Let's go to my custom menu here. So I've added a custom menu, and I'm not saying all of these settings are something that I use all the time, but in my custom menu here, you can see I've got variable frame rate settings, focus peaking, exposure offset adjust, which I actually do like to use sometimes, and it's very useful. So exposure offset adjust, I'll explain what it does. So let's say you're in a semi-manual exposure mode, and in this case I'm in a low light environment, but the camera is trying to read middle gray and it's trying to overexpose everything. I can just use my exposure compensation to maybe go down by, I don't know, 1 stop, But if you don't like seeing that -1 all the time, you can use exposure offset adjust based on the metering mode. I can say -1 EV, and it says it has no effect on the actual exposure compensation value. But as you can see, even though the exposure EV is set to 0, I'm actually getting an effective -1 EV. Now, another thing to be aware of is it actually is going -1 EV, because if I go up, I can get up to +3, right? But if I go down, it's only -2. So it's just simply offsetting the actual number down here and not necessarily giving me an additional stop of EV in the negative direction. So just keep that in mind. Let's go ahead and set this back to 0. I hope that this video gives you a sense of how I work with this camera. So everyone likes to customize a camera their own way, and so even if you don't like my settings, I think you have found something useful from this video. At least that's what I hope. And so if you have any questions, just ask them and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. And thanks for watching.